Well, hello. Hi, how are you? Welcome to Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So that's what I talk about. If you like true crime and you want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and come hang out with me every Tuesday where I take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on my war paint. Happy March. I can't believe we're already 3 months into 2022. Thank you so much to anyone and everyone that has ever watched one of my videos, liked, subscribed, commented, whatnot. I know I'm not really, like anyone, and it's, in the grand scheme of things, not a whole lot, but I truly appreciate it. So thank you so much. I am especially excited to talk about all the cases this month. Today's case in particular is... wow, a mind blower, okay? A mind blower. And I knew I just had to talk about it. There's actually a 48 hours mystery episode about this case, which you can find on YouTube. Video quality isn't the great, but it's definitely watchable. And after I saw it, I was like, oh my God, I have to talk about this case. I have to do a deep dive and look even further into this case and find out even more details because... let me tell you, it's wild. This was definitely, I think, one of the first cases that I've covered that, really stuck with me. I think the only other case that probably stuck with me more, or as much, would probably be the Bianca Devins case. This case today really stuck with me, and I'm very anxious to talk to y'all about it. Today, we will be talking about Charlie Brandt, the secret serial killer. And this guy is... He's the type of killer that creeps me out, all right? Because he's just hidden in plain view, He's one of those types. I know for the last couple of videos I've said we don't really need disclaimers. Today's video, we will be talking about dismemberment. Now, nothing too, gory, but the discussion is going to be around dismemberment quite often, so just be forewarned. And yeah, without further ado, let's talk about Charlie Brandt. We're actually not going to start with Charlie, though. We are going to start with Michelle Lynn Jones, okay? So who's Michelle? Well, Michelle was born September 17th, 1966 in Camp Springs, Maryland. Her parents were Bill and Mary Lou Jones of Durham, North Carolina. And she also has a brother named Sean. Now, Michelle was described as just being a very passionate person. She loved the outdoors. She was very, ambitious, had a lot of goals, just one of those people that just really embraced life, and lived life to the fullest. She was very dedicated and loyal to her friends and family. And she graduated Lake Brantley High School in Altamont Springs, Florida in 1984. And she would later go on to graduate from the University of Florida. A lifelong friend named Debbie Knight. She described Michelle as being, like I said earlier, ambitious and someone who, quote, embraced life with a passion. So that's Michelle. Now we're gonna flash forward. We're in Florida, but we're not flashing Florida. Flash forward to September 11th, 2004, okay? Michelle, she's 37 years old at this point, and she lives in Orlando, and she has a very successful career as a television executive for Golf TV. She was specifically the sales manager for infomercials and direct sales, and she really loved her job, and she was very successful. So around this time, Hurricane Ivan it's ripping through the East Coast, okay? It's getting pretty bad, and an evacuation order had been made for the Florida Keys. Now, Michelle, she was keeping a very close eye on developments with this because her aunt and uncle lived in the Florida Keys. Keys, and she was worried about them. Her aunt and uncle was her Aunt Terry and Uncle Charlie. They had been together for 17 years, and Terry was her mother's sister, so Terry is her aunt by blood, and Charlie is her uncle by marriage. And yeah, they lived in the Florida Keys, and when the evacuation order went out, Michelle called them up and was like, hey, why don't you come over here to Orlando with me where it's safe and wait out the storm? So Michelle had a really close relationship with her aunt and uncle, specifically her Aunt Terry, because Terry was only 8 years old when Michelle was born, you know? So they kind of like semi-grew up together. And so they had a pretty close relationship. And Terry and Charlie would often come over to visit Michelle in Orlando. So yeah, they head over there to weather out Hurricane Ivan. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Michelle's aunt and uncle, all right? So who's Aunt Terry? Well, Aunt Terry was actually born Teresa Marie Helfrich, and she was born March 16th, 1958 in Tachikawa, Japan. Her parents were Anthony George Helfrich and Mary Jane Brown Helfrich. And now Teresa, or Terry, as she went by, she came from a pretty large family. She had several siblings. On top of Mary Lou, Michelle's mother, she had two other sisters named Claudia and Patricia. And then she also had two brothers named Michael and Marty. Now, Terry was described as just being one of those people that was just very laid back, you know, just very go with the flow, like nothing seemed to bother her. She was always just a very happy, vivacious, bright person, you know. I always wish I could be like that. I wish I could embrace the chaos more. But yeah, it is said that Terry was very much had that kind of personality. She was even described as being, quote, gypsy-like. So who was Uncle Charlie? Well, he was born Carl Eric Brandt, and he was born at February 23rd, 1957, and he was born in Connecticut. His parents were Ilse Brandt and Herbert Brandt, and they were German immigrants. They had actually escaped war-torn Germany and had migrated to Texas in 1955 before settling in Connecticut. Herbert was a day laborer at International Harvester in the day, and at night he attended college courses, and this enabled him to work his way up to project engineer, and then the Brandt family was transferred to the Fort Wayne, Indiana branch. Charlie, like Terry, had numerous siblings. He had an older sister named Angela and two younger sisters named Jessica and Melanie. Now, it is said that the Brandt family, they moved around quite a bit, and it is said that Carl, or Charlie, as he was called sometimes, kind of found it hard to adjust a little bit. He kind of found it a little difficult to adjust to his new surroundings all the time. As a child, he was a very quiet, mild-mannered, well-behaved boy, like that quintessential boy next door, you know. He did well in school, wore button-down shirts a la Michael Scott at school, you know, and he was always seen around the neighborhood, you know, riding his bike and towing his little sisters behind him. He even watched like other neighbors' children and stuff. Yeah, he was just that quintessential boy next door. They all seemed to be, right? Right? Charlie would go on to graduate from Seabreeze High School in Florida. And he would go on to earn an associate's degree at Daytona Beach Community College and later earn a degree in electronics, and he ended up becoming an engineer. Specifically, he was a radar specialist and he worked with Lockheed Martin. Now, whereas Terry was described as like a very outgoing, sociable type of person, you know, like the life of the party, Charlie was kind of the opposite. He was more of the type to sort of like sit back and observe, you know, not really say a whole lot. Some described him as, quote, an oddball, quote, eccentric, and not gonna lie, feel a little called out here because that's totally my personality. personality. I'm very much a sit back and observe, only speak when I have something to say, unless I have something to drink, and then you just can't get me to shut up. But yeah, not gonna lie, I felt a little called out. But yeah, that was Charlie, just very quiet. But he wasn't considered like creepy or anything when he would just sit back and observe, you know? He was just considered a quiet, shy guy, you know? Now, Charlie and Terry, they had met on a blind date in 1985 that was set up by friends. And at the time, Terry was working at a retail store and Charlie was a radar specialist. And the two they just clicked, all right? They hit it off and hit it off so well that only the very next year, on August 29th, 1986, the two were married. And throughout their 17 years of marriage, the couple was described as just being inseparable, all right? Like, they just were always around each other, always doted on each other, were affectionate with each other. They were just that quintessential couple that you wanted to be, you know? A good friend of Terry's named Melanie Fletcher, she has said that if her husband could love her only a third of the amount that Charlie loved Terry, she would consider herself the luckiest woman in the world. Yeah, that's how devoted and affectionate they were. Like, and everyone saw it. Melanie said that she never saw them argue, never saw them bicker at each other. She said she never even saw Charlie, like, get a temper. Like, she didn't even think that he had a fuse. He had never raised his voice, never gotten angry. And yeah, neighbors loved hanging out with the Brandts, loved going to their neighborhood barbecues where it was very much a communal affair, you know, like everyone sort of pitched in, and everyone saw just how much Charlie doted on Terry and Terry doted on Charlie. They just seemed like they were made for each other and just so happy with each other. They even still made each other's lunches because lunch always tasted better when it was made by someone you loved. Yeah, they were that couple. So Terry and Charlie, they arrive at Michelle's on September 11th, 2004 to wait out Hurricane Ivan with their niece. And Charlie and Terry, they would end up staying for a couple of days. The very next day, on the 12th, they actually went and visited Charlie's father and his little sister Jessica over in Ormond Beach. And yeah, they all just kind of hang out. They made bread, they drank, they talked, they laughed. Later on in the evening, they went to Jessica's house for dinner. And while there, Charlie and Jessica called their other siblings, Melanie and Angela, because, you know, they knew that Charlie and Terry were evacuating. And yeah, they were just keeping in touch. And when Angela talked to her little brother, Charlie, she was like, "Hey, bro, I really need to talk to you. We should meet up tomorrow," which would have been the 13th. And he was like, you know, "Sorry, sis, we're actually going to head back home. The storm has passed." Very anxious to get back home. Apparently, Charlie was a, like, hunker down type. He wasn't really an evacuate type, so he was pretty anxious to get back home. But yeah, the rest of the evening went off without a hitch. They had a great time, had a great meal. One weird thing that did happen, though, that was kind of weird, was when they left, Charlie gave his father and his sister a very tight, long embrace, which is very unusual for Charlie. He was very much a handshake and, you know, pat on the back kind of guy, so that was a little weird. But yeah, Charlie and Terry left back to Michelle's. So the next day comes the 13th. It's the day that Charlie and Terry are supposed to leave, but Charlie, for whatever reason, he decides that he wants to stay another night. He wants to stay another night. Now, again, very weird because just the night previous, he told Angela that he was really anxious to get back home, you know. Now, Michelle, she called her friend Debbie. She was going to have plans with her in a couple days, and she called her just to kind of talk, and she expressed a little bit of annoyance that her aunt and uncle had decided to stay an extra night, you know. She's a little annoyed. And apparently Terry wasn't really fond of this either. She also wanted to get back home. Like, the storm had passed, and she wanted to get back to her life, you know. And it was really Charlie who wanted to stay. So I'm not sure why she didn't ask her aunt and uncle to leave. Maybe just because, you know, they were close and she just thought like, okay, staying an extra night, whatever. So yeah, the Brandts end up staying an extra night, and that evening, Charlie, Terry, and Michelle, they all have dinner together. Charlie made up some kind of fish, and they had some wine. And later on, Michelle calls another friend, another close friend named Lisa Emmons. She had invited Lisa over that day to come over that night, but now she was calling her to tell her, like, that's probably not the best idea. She said that her aunt and uncle were sort of, like, just kind of bickering and arguing with each other, and they just weren't really in the best mood for company, you know? And so she's like, you know what, and we've had a little bit too much to drink, I'm tired, I just want to lay down and go to bed, you know? And so Lisa's like, yeah, of course, I'll talk to you later. So a couple days go by, and neither Debbie or Lisa or any of Michelle's friends can get a hold of her, which is pretty unusual, because Michelle was one of those people that was like always in contact with somebody, you know? She was that type where she would call you back within 20 to 30 minutes, you know? And so when a couple days went by and no one can get a hold of her, even her mother, Mary Lou, some red flags started popping up, you know? It was kind of weird. When the 15th rolled around, the 15th of September rolled around, and Mary Lou had still not heard of her daughter, which was weird because she knew that her sister and Charlie were waiting out the storm with her daughter, so she was expecting communication from somebody, but she hadn't heard anything from anyone. So yeah, when the 15th rolls around, she calls up Michelle's friend, Debbie. She knew that Debbie had a key to Michelle's house. So she calls her up, you know, and is just like, hey, since you have a key, will you just go over to Michelle's house and just kind of check on her? You know, I haven't heard from her. It's really weird. And yeah, could you just go check on her for me? And which, of course, Debbie's like, yeah, of course. So she stays on the phone with Mary Lou and walks over to Michelle's house. I think she lived like super close by. And so she's on the phone with Mary Lou and she walks to Michelle's house and she immediately sees some stuff that's off, right? The garage lights are on, which is kind of weird. There was mail piled in the mailbox, like it hadn't been checked in a few days. There were newspapers on the front lawn, still wrapped up, still in their plastic, like they hadn't been picked up. And Charlie's car was in the driveway, which was weird because Aunt Terry and Uncle Charlie should have been gone by now. So Debbie walks up to the front door, and for some reason, I was a little confused about this. I didn't get any clear explanation. But for whatever reason, Debbie's key would not open Michelle's front door. Yeah, I have no idea. So remember, she's still on the phone with Mary Lou, and she's like, well, you know what? Let me go around back, because Michelle had a garage, and it was located in the back, and it had like large glass windows that you could peer into. And so she's like, let me walk around back and peer into there. And, you know, the lights were on, so maybe Michelle was in there, see if her car was in there, you know. So the next thing Mary Lou hears is Debbie's blood-curdling blood-curdling scream over the phone. Debbie, when she had peered into Michelle's garage, she saw Charlie Brandt hanging from the rafters of the garage, wearing a white polo shirt and blue shorts dangling 2 feet above the ground. Yeah, needless to say, a little traumatic, right? So, yeah, police are called. And 3 young police officers, they're the first to arrive on scene. They arrive on scene. And Debbie says that when they approached Michelle's house and entered the home, they were in there for only about 40 seconds before all 3 of them had dashed out of the house and started throwing up in the front yard. Yeah. Now, investigator Rob Hemmer with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, he was the investigator, and so he arrived on scene. And he described what he saw when he walked into Michelle's house. So he immediately noticed there were some bags all packed and ready to go, and like a blue Coleman cooler filled with some drinks by Michelle's door. Obviously, these were the Brandt's bags packed by the door, ready to leave. He proceeds into the living room. He sees a drop of blood on a photo box that's on a coffee table in the living room. he sees a wine glass on an end table, and slumped on the couch, wearing nothing but a yellow t-shirt, was Charlie Brandt. She had been stabbed about 7 times in the chest. Terry's attack was very fast and very frenzied. There were defensive wounds on her left hand, indicating that she had fended off her attacker. As Investigator Hemmert continued his way through the house, he came across Michelle's bedroom, and this is where we're going to talk about some dismemberment, so, just be forewarned. So he came into Michelle's bedroom, and on her bed was Michelle's body. Her head and heart had been completely removed. Her head, completely decapitated, had been placed next to her body, looking down on it. The hair had been brushed out of her eyes, and her whole body had been carefully and selectively dismembered. Her breasts, abdominal wall, liver, a section of intestines and colon had all been removed and placed next to the body on the bed. Her left leg had been removed at the femoral head, which is at the hip, and her upper left arm had also been completely removed. And her chest cavity had been cut wide open. What was done to Michelle would have taken time, would have taken precision, would have taken thought and consideration. It took a very long time. Whereas Terry suffered multiple stab wounds, Michelle suffered a single stab wound to the chest. Her bloodied clothes were in the sink. Some more clothes were found piled at the foot of her bed. And, stranger still, scattered across her bedroom were several Victoria's Secret bras and panties that had been cut up and sprinkled all over the room. Terry and Michelle had been killed with Michelle's own kitchen knives. And when Investigator Hemmert stumbled across Charlie Brandt in the garage, he saw him hanging from a yellow bedsheet that had been tied into a noose, and there had been a ladder nearby, and it was pretty clear that it was suicide, and there was no note. Now, Investigator Hemmert says that he pretty much immediately suspected Charlie of the murders. He pretty much immediately suspected a murder-suicide. Charlie had evidently cleaned himself up. It was actually his clothes at the foot of Michelle's bed, washed himself up before killing himself. And it is thought that he killed Terry first, so he wouldn't be disturbed as he violated Michelle's body. It is thought that what was done to Michelle was an ultimate fantasy for Charlie come through. It was the ultimate fantasy. Yeah. The three had been locked in Michelle's home for a few days, since at least the 13th, so it had been about 2 days. Now, needless to say, friends and family were completely blown away. They were completely shocked. Friends of Charlie had trouble, just wrangling with this, because they were like, wait, Charlie did this horrendous, awful thing? No, you don't understand. This was the quiet, mild-mannered guy. This was the environmentally conscious guy who, wrangled whether or not to use weed killer, wrangled whether or not to kill a fish when he went fishing, it didn't add up. Moreover, all friends and family could testify for 17 years that Charlie had completely doted on Terry, had completely been devoted, had been completely in love with her, and it just didn't add up. And I think that is one of the reasons this case really stuck with me and really sort of mind-effed with me, because, Jeff and I have been together 12 and a half years, and I feel, we still do these kinds of things, affectionate and, doting on each other. He's totally the type of guy to go put gas in my car if I have something to do, and when you hear that, Charlie did the exact same things for his wife, and then he did something like this, it really F's with you. I'm not gonna lie, it caused me to sort of side-eye Jeff there, and just be like, what's really going on in your mind, it's unfathomable. was just mind-blowing to everyone. Authorities also discovered that Charlie had harbored a secret obsession with his niece Michelle for quite some time. I know, he was the creepy uncle. Apparently, at his job, he would always talk about his niece and how beautiful she was, how she could be a model, how, good looking she was, and how hot her body was. One coworker said that he didn't even know Michelle's name because Charlie never referred to her by name. He referred to her as Victoria. Victoria's Secret. I know. Now, of course, after the discoveries, Terry and Charlie's place in Pine Key, West Florida was, of course, searched, and authorities found it boarded up, because for the hurricane, and it was boarded up meticulously, and I do mean meticulously. Investigator Hemmer said that it looked like each board in a window. It looked as if that board had been custom fit and made for that window. It was done with precision. And inside, same story. It was just very neat and orderly, everything in its place. And even Terry's diaries that they found painted this just happy, simple life that they were living. Now, Terry's diaries, they weren't typical diaries. They didn't contain paragraphs or anything like that. They just contained phrases, stuff quote, caught fish, quote, had a good dinner with Charlie, that kind of stuff. And there was just nothing in these diaries to suggest that anything like what happened was gonna happen, there was sort of no foreshadowing in these diaries of Terry. Although there were a couple of mentions of, quote, weird days. There were a couple of times where Terry noted that Charlie had been out all night, and some other weird things, other phrases quote, weird day, were found, just kind of sprinkled here and there throughout. But, other than that, there was really nothing too detailed or anything that could really answer the questions that investigators had, As authorities continued into the Brandt home, they were pretty disturbed to find a poster on the inside of the Brandt's bedroom door, all right? This poster was an anatomy poster, all right? It depicted in graphic detail the female skeletal and muscular system. It was one of those posters that you would expect to see in a doctor's office or something, It was literally titled the female skeletal and muscular system. It's something that you would expect to see in a doctor's office or a medical classroom or something. Now, neither Charlie nor Terry had anything to do with the medical profession. Anything at all. So it was kind of weird. And investigators were scratching their heads because this is something Terry would have seen every day leaving, and it just didn't add up. It was really weird. And if your mind wasn't already blown and just creeped out by everything, investigators noticed that on this poster, which you can see right here, because I found the actual poster that was hanging up, the exposed parts of the female body on the poster just so happened to be eerily similar to the parts that were exposed and dismembered on Michelle. Yeah. Has this case gripped you yet? I was just, my mind was blown with every fact that I learned about this case. It's amazing. Now, investigators also found a large collection of medical and anatomy books. Again, neither Charlie nor Terry were in the medical field, so it was weird. There was even a bunch of newspaper clippings in relation to medical stuff and stuff like that. There was a newspaper clipping. It was a detailed diagram of a human heart. So yeah, stuff like that. Really weird. And it gets weirder. This case it gets weirder. I've got even more mind-blowing stuff to tell y'all, all right? So they also found a large collection of Victoria's Secret catalogs in the Brandt home, and they were all addressed to Charlie. Yeah. And when investigators searched Charlie's computer, whoo boy, oh my gosh, the things they saw that Charlie was looking at and searching online, it's pretty gnarly. So they saw that he would frequent sites about necrophilia and death fantasies, autopsies of models posing as corpses, violence against women. Yeah. Specific search topics included erotic horror and death fetish erotica, dead women autopsies, disembowelment, dark fantasies, and drop dead gorgeous. Yeah, he was looking at some pretty gnarly stuff. And the more investigators dug into his online life, the more similarities they saw with what had happened to Michelle. Yeah, Charlie had apparently been planning this for quite some time. Again, this was like the ultimate fantasy come true. Yeah. Now, based on everything that he was finding, and based on the way Michelle was dismembered and like what was done to her, Investigator Hemmer was theorizing that this was not Charlie's first kill. This was not Charlie's first kill. And guess what? He was right. It was not his first kill. So, mere days after the murder-suicide, Angela, Charlie's older sister, she missed a police briefing that the family had. And she was actually in the police parking lot, and she waited for her family to leave. And when they left, that's when she walked into the station and divulged to police the dark Brandt family secret. All right. Now this is something else. So we're gonna do a flashback now. All right, we're gonna go back in time. All right. We're going to go to January 3rd, 1971. At this time, Charlie is 13, Angela is 15, and the two younger sisters, Jessica and Melanie, are 3 and 2. The Brandt family resides in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Ilsa Brandt at this time is 40, and she is 8 months pregnant with the family's 5th child, a baby boy. Herbert is 39. And the family had just gotten back from their yearly Christmas vacation that they took in Florida every year. This was a very special time and place for the family. They would always go to Florida for the summer and Christmas holidays. While there, they would, hunt quail and other small game. They'd go to the beach. It was a really good time, Unfortunately, on this past trip, something tragic did occur. So the family had a family dog. It was a family Christmas present from the year before. And, it was kind of a turd. It didn't really listen, wasn't really obedient, but it is said that Charlie took great care and pride in caring for the dog, even, if it didn't really listen all that well. Well, on this past trip, Herbert and Charlie were out hunting and the dog ran away. And the next day, when Herbert and Charlie were out hunting again, they saw their dog. And of course, because the dog isn't really obedient, when they call to it, it just kind of runs off. And it runs off into like some brush, into like some trees, into like a brush area. And Herbert said that when the dog refused to come when he called it, that's when he fired off a couple of rounds of his gun. Now, I don't know if Herbert just shouldn't be handling firearms or what. He claimed it was just to scare the dog out of the brush, but Herbert had instead shot the dog. Yeah. So, that had happened on this past family trip, so that was kind of a bummer. But, other than that, everything else, went okay. So, it was just after 9 p.m. on January 3rd, 1971, like I said. And the family had, just eaten dinner. They'd had pork chops and hash browns and green beans, which sounds very delish, by the way. And Charlie was at the kitchen table doing some homework. Angela was in her room reading a book in bed. Jessica and Melanie were asleep in their rooms, and Ilsa was drawing a bath while Herbert was shaving. Now, Angela's in her bed, and she said the next thing she hears is her father yell, "Charlie, don't." Charlie had walked up behind his father and shot him in the back with a Luger pistol. And for safety reasons, Herbert had kept this pistol in his dresser loaded with an empty clip, which means Charlie would have had to get the gun, empty out the empty clip, and load a full clip in. He then stood over his mother, who was 8 months pregnant and in the bathtub, and fired several shots into her. Yeah. Angela said that she heard her mother shout, "Angela, call the police." But the next thing Angela knew, Charlie was in front of her with the gun drawn. Now, I'm a little unclear as to where Angela was when all this went down. Like, I know she was in her room when she heard her father shout out. Surely she heard the gunshots. So not sure if she's like in the hallway, if she's downstairs. Little unclear. Just that the next thing Angela knows, Charlie is standing in front of her with the gun drawn, and he pulls the trigger. But miraculously, the gun jammed. I read other reports that said he had emptied the clip, shooting his parents, but either way, the gun didn't go off. But that didn't stop Charlie. The next thing Angela knew, Charlie was on top of her, and she was physically fighting her little brother for life. He was strangling her, and she was trying to just, like, scream and shout. She kept shouting, like, I love you, Charlie, you're my brother, what are you doing? You know, stuff like that, just trying to get through, just telling him and repeating over and over how much she loved him. And Angela says that this like, glazed over, mad look that her brother had, it suddenly, like, dissipated, and he got off of her. And he asks her, "You're not going to leave me, are you?" To which Angela, barely keeping her composure together, understandably, was like, "No, of course not. Like, no, we'll go live together. You know, I'll go get Jessica and Melanie, go get them some blankets, and we'll go leave together. You know, we'll go live boxcar children style." You know, she was just trying to think of anything to get him to leave, and it took some convincing. But she gets Charlie to turn his back and start walk down the hall to Jessica and Melanie's room. And that's when Angela just books it. Bolts right out the front door in her nightgown, streaked with blood into the snow because it's January in Indiana, so it was snowing. And she goes and pounds on the nearest neighbor's door. And the nearest neighbors happen to be the Radcliffes. And she, pounds on their door, rings the doorbell, but they take too long to answer, and so she is off to the next neighbor's house. Now, 16-year-old Sandy Radcliffe, she had just gotten out of the shower when she heard Angela's frantic knocks and doorbells. And by the time she got downstairs to the door, she now just heard a soft knock, knock, knock. And she opened the door, and it's not Angela, it is Charlie. Sandy said that Charlie's eyes were dilated, like they were black. They were so dilated. His pupils were so dilated. And he says, quote, "Sandy, I shot my mom and dad." And when he repeats himself, and it kind of clicks for Sandy that this isn't some kind of prank, this isn't, like, he's being serious. And so she books it over to the Brandt's house. And, she's unable to open the front door, which I was a little confused about. So maybe they had one of those front doors that locks automatically when you shut it, you know? It wasn't until Officer James Quinn arrived on scene that the door was broken down. Angela had gone to another neighbor who had answered their door, and she had managed to call police. So yeah, Officer Quinn breaks the door down and enters the Brandt residence. He could hear Herbert Brandt faintly yelling for help from the bedroom. Herbert was still had shaving cream on his face, was bleeding profusely from a wound to his abdomen. He had managed to drain the tub so his wife wouldn't drown, go to the bedroom door and lock it when Charlie had left to go shoot Angela, and had just was asking for help on the floor, losing a lot of blood. Ilsa, unfortunately, even though he drained the tub, would die from blood loss. and so would her unborn son. Jessica and Melanie had slept through their entire incident. They had been safe and sound in their beds the whole time.
Now, needless to say, this crime sent a shockwave through the community.
Not just because it was this 13-year-old boy who had murdered his 8 months pregnant mother, but that it was Charlie who had done it. Remember earlier I said he was like the quintessential boy next door, like people just couldn't wrap their heads around it. And not just that, Charlie had a very close relationship with his mother. He was even described as a, quote, mama's boy. So it just threw everyone for a loop. Herbert managed to survive his wounds. He was rushed to the hospital, and Detective Dan Fiegel also rushed to the hospital to try to get a statement from Herbert. And, all Herbert kept saying was, I don't know why he did this. I don't know why he did this. My son is the nicest boy you could ever meet. I don't know why my son did this. He didn't know either. So Detective Dan Fiegel, of course, puts 13-year-old Charlie in custody. He said Charlie was in shock, and yes, his pupils were very dilated. And even Charlie himself didn't know why he had done this. He had no explanation. He said, quote, I didn't really want to. It was like I was sort of programmed. I hesitated, but the next thing I known, I had shot them. Now, it was thought that maybe the incident with the dog on this past family trip was the trigger for Charlie, because they were trying to think of something, man, because, the Brandts were a loving family. There was no abuse or anything like that. So they were trying to think of any explanation as to why a 13-year-old Charlie would do such a thing, And no one could ever come up with any concrete answers. The court ended up ordering Charlie to undergo 3 different psychological evaluations, and all 3 of the psychologists who examined Charlie could only agree on one thing: that Charlie was something of an enigma. They couldn't find anything classically wrong with him, He didn't suffer from any hallucinations or delusions. He was mature for his age. He was competent. And all the reports just seemed to outline all of the things that Charlie wasn't, not what was, wrong with him. They couldn't find any typical signs of mental illness, even though obviously there was something wrong with him, Now, I'm not sure what the knowledge on mental illness back then was. I'm not sure. I don't know if Charlie would have been diagnosed with something today. What do you think? Do you think Charlie would have been diagnosed with something today? I don't know. Now, in Indiana, Charlie could not be held criminally responsible for his crimes. In the state of Indiana, those under 14 years old cannot be held criminally responsible because it's thought, they're not quite developed. They don't really grasp the weight or the consequences of their actions, because they're not fully developed. So, get this. Charlie was never brought up on any charges and never brought to trial at all. Instead, in May of 1971, a 6-person grand jury suggested psychiatric treatment. But they did offer a warning. They did offer a warning that this kind of behavior could potentially rear its ugly head again. They warned that if Charlie went untreated or undertreated, that quote, it is possible that such antisocial conduct could repeat itself in the future. So Charlie was sent to Central State Hospital in Indianapolis, where, get this, y'all, he spent only about a year there before his father, Herbert, the one that he had attempted to kill, won his release. Yeah, wrap your mind around that for a second. Won his release. By this time, Herbert had remarried. I know.
I know, he had already remarried, and in the fall of 1972, he uprooted the whole family to Ormond Beach, Florida. But records do show that in 1974, Herbert, his new wife, and the two young siblings, Jessica and Melanie, they would return to Indianapolis. But Angela, who was 19, and Charlie, who was 17 at this time, they stayed behind in Florida. Now, Angela had dropped out of school at 16 in order to help care for Jessica and Melanie, and she would later go on to earn her GED, and she was living on her own by then. And Charlie, he was finishing up high school in Florida, and his grandparents had actually moved in from Germany to, ensure that he graduated. Now, neighbors in Indianapolis, where Herbert and the family lived until about 1980, they said that they weren't even aware Herbert had any other children. They thought it was just Jessica and Melanie. And another neighbor who lived near the Brandts in Fort Wayne, her name's Elaine Kriz. Now, she claims that Herbert was actually pretty reluctant to take Charlie back. Yeah, was actually pretty reluctant, which again is just kind of weird to me because I read reports that said that Herbert was fighting to release Charlie through the courts. So I don't know. But according to Elaine, Herbert, wasn't really all that keen on taking Charlie back. And when Charlie did come back, he was kept from view. He no longer rode his bike around the neighborhood, no longer played. He was kept in the house and kept from view. And it was not long after that the Brandts had up and moved to Florida. Now, get this, as if your mind couldn't be any more blown. Herbert never once spoke to Charlie about what he did. Not once. No one ever talked about it. Ever again. Can you believe that? In fact, Herbert never told the two young ones, Jessica and Melanie, what had actually happened to their mother. He told them that their mother had died in a car crash. I know. I've got more thoughts on Herbert, but I'll wait till later. Now, Angela had never held any anger or anything towards her brother. She harbored some fear from him, though, When she herself became a mother in 1979, she never allowed her brother to stay the night. It is said that she would not sleep with a fan on or an AC or any type of ambient noise because she was afraid that if those things were running, she wouldn't be able to hear if Charlie broke into her house and decided to finish the job, Yeah. Now, Jim Graves. Who's Jim Graves? Well, Jim Graves, he was married to Angela. He was Angela's husband for a time. And he recalls when Angela told him about her brother's dark past. Now, Jim says that after getting to know Charlie, it seemed to him that whatever happened when he was 13 seemed to be behind him because he was a perfectly friendly, ordinary guy. Jim said that he was very gentle. He was the type of guy that wouldn't smash or kill bugs. He would pick them up and go put them outside, which, yeah, no, by the way, in my house, we kill bugs. No, if you want to take the bug and walk it a mile away from me, that's fine. But no, we don't do bugs in my house. Although there was one incident that Jim recalled that in hindsight kind of seemed kind of weird and ominous, and I will be right back to tell you what that was. So this chilling conversation that Jim had with Charlie happened when Jim had first split up with Angela, and they had gone fishing, and they were talking, and, Jim, of course, was, pretty sad and depressed at the breakup of his marriage, and the topic of conversation turned to revenge. And Charlie told Jim that if you really want to get revenge on someone, you should murder them and cut their heart out. Yeah, kind of weird. Now, one last little fun fact about Jim here. He is the one who introduced Charlie and Terry. Or at least he had a very big hand in it, okay? Jim started dating a new woman, and she wanted to set up her friend Terry with someone. And she was like, hey, Jim, do you know anyone? And he was like, I got just the guy, my buddy Charlie. Yeah, look, maybe this makes me a bad person, but if I knew someone had a past like that, even if I thought they had gotten over it or that they were like perfectly fine now, I don't know if in good conscience, I don't know if I could set them up with someone. Like, could you? Like, please tell me, like, could you, if you were Jim, could you set Charlie up with someone? I'm curious to know. Jim was even the best man at Charlie and Terry's wedding, a wedding, by the way, that their own families weren't even invited to. Now, there is wide speculation and debate on whether Terry was aware of her husband's past. So Mary Lou, her sister, Michelle's mother, she insists that there's no way her sister knew about Charlie's past, because had she had known, there's no way she would be with Charlie. There's just no way. And Bill, Mary Lou's husband and Michelle's father, he said that Terry was a blabbermouth, and there's no way she wouldn't have divulged that information to Mary Lou. Now, Jim says that Terry was aware. He thought Terry was aware. So he said that one time when he was visiting the couple, not long after they married, the topic of kids came up. And Terry said, quote, considering everything, she didn't think it was a good idea that her and Charlie, had kids. And so Jim took that to mean that Charlie had told her. Even Angela thought that Terry was aware. So Angela said that Charlie had come to her before they were married and had asked Angela, like, hey, should I tell Terry about my past? Like, he wanted to build a life with her and, this, that, and the other. And Angela straight up told him, yeah, you better tell her. And not just that, you need to realize that when you tell her, it very well may end the relationship and there's nothing you can do about it. And Angela said that Charlie agreed with her and was like, you know what, sis, you're right, and I am going to tell her. And then not long after that, they were married. And Angela said when she was welcoming Terry to the family, she, like, oh, you're such a special person, hugging her, embracing her. She said, quote, Charlie told you about himself and you married him anyway. And Terry just hugged her back and embraced her new sister-in-law. So, yeah, honestly, we'll never know for sure if Terry was aware of her husband's past, what she knew, if anything. And honestly, I could see both. I really could. Now, love makes people do all kinds of things they normally wouldn't do, right? Like, it makes people act out of character all the time. So I could very well believe that Terry could have known and not told anyone, not Mary Lou, not anyone, because again, there are sometimes, things with couples that just kind of stay behind closed doors, right? Like, you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. But at the same time, I could also buy that, if someone had told me something like that, especially a guy I'm dating, I don't think there's any way I would keep that a secret. Like, I think I would spill that tea real quick. So I have no idea. I honestly do not know. What do you think? Do you think Terry was aware of her husband's past? Like, please let me know. I'm super curious to know what you guys think. Now, when Angela dropped this bombshell on police, they then began working the theory that Charlie Brandt was, in fact, a serial killer. And they actually found out that because of his job, Charlie traveled all over the state, all over the country, sometimes out of the country. And they cross-referenced unsolved murders with the places that he had been, and then called those local jurisdictions and was just like, hey, you got any unsolved murders? You need to send them our way. They were specifically looking for murders that had to do with dismemberment, head removal, specifically heart removal. That was a really big one they were looking for. And of course, a whole bunch of cases dropped on their lap. And it was now up to authorities to sift through and see which ones could have Charlie Brandt potentially have committed. And there was one case that stood out to them. It was an unsolved murder from 1995 in Miami, and the victim was Darlene Toller, who was a 38-year-old mother of 3. She was also a sex worker who primarily worked in Little Havana, and she had last been seen Thanksgiving evening, November 23rd, 1995, doing her job, flogging down motorists and such. Darlene's body had been found alongside a highway in southwest Miami-Dade County. Now, it just so happens that this highway was the same highway Charlie used to get in and out of the Florida Keys where he and Terry lived. Darlene's body had been wrapped up in a blanket that had been then wrapped up in plastic and tied up like she was like a neat ordered package. Her head and heart had been completely removed, and removed in a way that told authorities the killer knew what he was doing. Now, sadly, neither Darlene's head nor heart have ever been found. Now, dog hairs were found on Darlene's body, and the same kind of dog hairs were found in Charlie's truck. Apparently, Charlie watched a neighbor's dog, and that's how those dog hairs came to be there. Another clue that pointed investigators to suspect Charlie Brandt was also in Charlie's truck. They found a logbook that Charlie kept. Yeah, it was a logbook. And it was a logbook of times he had filled up gas. Yeah, weird, right? He would put down the mileage, the date, how much gas he put in, what he paid. Like, yeah, really weird. And they noticed that around the time of Darlene's death, there was a spike in the logbook of approximately 100 miles. Now, it just so happens that Charlie lived approximately 100 miles from Miami, and the investigators believed that Charlie had purposely gone to Miami in order to find a victim. Now, at the time, Charlie and Terry were working polar opposite schedules, so he had plenty of time and opportunity. Also, beginning around 1993, this is when we start to see some of those, quote, weird days in Terry's diary. There were things like, quote, Charlie a little depressed, quote, started to talk things out, talkative time, a bit emotional, quote, Charlie called, very emotional, quote, Charlie had a rough day, and, quote, weird talk, not a good night. Now, I tried finding updated information to Darlene's case. I couldn't find any updated information, so I do not know if her case has been officially closed and Charlie Brandt named as her killer. I was a little unclear about that. But there is another unsolved murder that Charlie Brandt was looked at, and this murder was even older. It was from July 19th, 1989, and get this, this murder happened merely 4 blocks, 1,000 feet from Charlie's own house. Yeah. So Charlie and Terry had only been living in Pine Key West for a few months when a body was discovered by some fishermen near the Pine Channel Bridge. They had picked up what they thought was a mannequin in their fishing nets. It's always a mannequin. You ever notice that? It's never a mannequin. It's never. It was a body. The victim was identified as Sherry Irene Parisho. She was born April 2nd, 1951, and she was a former beauty queen and a local drifter of the area. She called herself the Rainmaker, and she was always seen around town riding her bike, including on the day she was murdered. She lived on her little small rowboat / dinghy. She would, take it out there in the little shallows and spend the night there and stuff. And, like with Darlene and Michelle, Sherry's heart had been completely removed and removed with precision. And like with Darlene, her heart has never been found. Sherry's head was nearly decapitated. The killer had cut through her throat so severely they had cut through the spine, and investigators theorized that Sherry was actually killed on her little small rowboat. They think that she had been placed on the bottom with her arms and legs hanging out, because they had found some cut marks in the bottom of the boat, and so they think that's where she was dismembered. Now, Sherry hadn't been dead very long. She had only been in the water about 12 hours, and the only clue investigators had at the time was a sketch of a young man who was seen crossing the the highway around the time of the murder. Now, the sketch just so happens to look eerily similar to a young Charlie Brandt. And Jim Graves, remember Jim? He comes into play again. He said that not long after Sherry's murder, he was talking to Terry and she was wondering if she should go to the police. And he was like, why? And, Terry said, quote, because of Charlie's past. However, when Jim talked to authorities and testified under oath, he was a bit more detailed. He said that Terry wanted to go to the police because she had come downstairs and Charlie was covered in blood and it was late at night. I read another report that said Charlie had come home wet and covered in blood, but either way, Terry came across Charlie covered in blood at night on a weekday, and Charlie told her that he had just been filleting some fish when Terry had asked, what's up? And yeah, Terry seemed to believe him. Now, it seems like authorities officially closed Sherry's case in May of 2006 in a September 2006 article in the Miami Herald. Then Monroe County Sheriff Rick Roth, he said in a statement that, quote, his department was, quote, satisfied that Carl Brandt was the murderer of Sherry Parisho. Now, there are other murders that Charlie is a big suspect in, but all the ones that I saw, they didn't really have a lot of concrete information that linked him. Like, there wasn't really a lot of the same MO, so that is why I did not include it in this video. I just wanted to include the ones that we know that he did or more than likely did. And yeah, authorities and the Joneses, they have tried repeatedly to gain access to Charlie's mental health records that were kept when he stayed at that state hospital for a year. But get this. Herbert Brandt has fought tooth and nail in the courts to keep them sealed. Can you believe that? I'm sorry, but I think Herbert is a gigantic POS. I think he bears the weight of all of his son's crimes. The fact that he didn't get his son help, the fact that they never talked about it, no, I'm sorry. As far as I'm concerned, he's just as responsible as his son. Now, apparently, in July of 2006, an Indiana judge did release Charlie's mental health records to investigator Hemmert, but not to the public. All investigator Hemmert has said is that the records have gained him a little bit of insight into Charlie's motives for why he did these things. And in honor of Michelle's memory, her parents have tried to establish a database of sorts, similar to that for sex offenders, that would require anyone of any age who has ever killed anyone under any type of circumstance to register so another Charlie Brandt doesn't slip through the cracks. And yeah, that is the mind-blowing, creepy case of Charlie Brandt, the secret serial killer. And I don't know about you, but yeah, fact after fact of this case just repeatedly blew my mind. I can't believe that at 13, he was just able to walk free. I can't believe that his father, kept all of that hidden. Oh, by the way, the Brandts have never once reached out to the Jones for condolences or anything like that. Yeah, can you believe that? They released a generic statement when Michelle, Terry, and Charlie were first found that said that was quote, like everyone, we struggle to understand why. But yeah, they've never contacted the Joneses at all. And yeah, I just think that's pretty wild. I think it's pretty incredible that, his father would allow this to just be swept under the rug. It's just mind-blowing. And yeah, man, it really asks with your mind because again, him and Terry were considered the perfect couple. And yeah, man, these are the kind of cases that really creep me out. The ones that are just, there's no rhyme or reason behind it, yeah, I don't know. Please let me know your thoughts on this case. Did it blow your mind as much as me? I would love to know. I am super anxious to talk about next week's case. It's actually a two-parter because I got that swept up in it. So yeah, be ready for a two-parter. Also, wanted to give a quick happy birthday shout out to my mom. Her birthday's in a couple days, so happy birthday, Mom. She's always watching and liking and commenting on my videos, so thank you. Happy birthday. And until next week, I hope you stay safe, stay happy. Remember, don't be a dick, alright? Just be decent. Just be decent, alright? When you're interacting with other human beings, just be decent, okay? And I will see you next Tuesday for another Crime Dive. Bye-bye.